The banners of House Stark snapped in the wind above the wide green banks of the Trident, and the air was thick with dread anticipation when Robb Stark first led his host to the twins. The crossing was essential. South of the mighty river, victory or defeat in this dire war would be decided. Every moment was precious, every decision a matter of life and death. Robb was young, but a king in all but name, surrounded by lords sworn to Winterfell and many who had thrown off the shackles of old loyalties to follow him. At his side rode the Great Jon, grim-faced Roose Bolton, fiery Meage Mormont, and 100 other northern lords. Even though he was still recovering from the blow of Ned Stark's imprisonment and the tragedy that had befallen his sisters, he carried himself with the stoic poise of a man thrice his age. Already word had spread of the young wolf's cunning in battle and the loyalty he inspired in his men. Yet there stood the twins, locked tight behind the high walls of House Frey. The fortress rose on two sides of the river, the only crossing for many leagues. Lord Walder Frey, an old and cunning bannerman to House Tully, held the power of passage. To cross the twins, one needed Lord Frey's permission, or enough force to compel him. Men whispered that old Walder was as sly as a fox on a winter's night, and twice as treacherous. The evening before they arrived, Robb had called a council of his key advisors, a ring of tired men leaning over the rough-hewn table in his command tent. Candlelight flickered across the maps spread before them, illuminating small carved tokens representing the armies. The Lion of Lannister and the Dire Wolf of Stark. The twins had been represented simply by two small towers straddling a paper river. "We cannot get to Riverrun without that crossing," Roose Bolton had said in his quiet, measured voice. "Nor can we afford to wait for Walder Frey's slow hospitality. Tywin Lannister advances as we speak." Catelyn Stark, wearing her grief as a second cloak, had pressed her son's arm. "Walder Frey will not yield easily. We must bargain with him. Your father counted him an unreliable ally, but an ally all the same." Robb's jaw tightened at the mention of his father. "Then we must do more than bargain," he declared. "We'll do what we must. If he tries to hinder our crossing, I'll tear down his gates." Some thought this a rash approach. Others admired the steel in their young lord's voice. But the moment passed without firm resolution, and they broke for rest, intending to approach the twins come the morrow. Robb did not sleep long or well. Visions of Sansa and Arya haunted him, and the memory of his father's face in the courtyard of King's Landing, Honorable Ned Stark, caged like a criminal. Robb rose early and walked among the camp before dawn. In those morning hours, he resolved that he would do what was required to free his father and sisters and save the North from Lannister aggression. If Walder Frey demanded too much, the old weasel might just find himself with no choice but to yield. Their host made its approach under the rising sun. The spearmen were arrayed in proud ranks, and the horses pounded the ground. The wolves of the north halted out of bowshot, and Robb rode forward flanked by the Great Jon and Roose Bolton. The gates stayed firmly shut. Distant figures in Frey livery watched from the walls with crossbows ready, while on the eastern side of the river men brandished pikes near the eastern tower. Lord Walder was in no rush to greet them. Hours passed while parley was demanded. Finally, a single Frey cousin or nephew, Robb could not recall how they were all connected, rode out with a hunched posture, glancing warily at the ranks of northern men. He wasted no time with courtesies. "Lord Frey demands your presence at the gatehouse, my Lord Stark." The man's voice was thin and edgy. "He will see you within, but only with a small escort." Robb listened and studied the gates. "A small escort," he said, and his tone was cool. "Very well." Great Jon Umber let out a gruff snort of disapproval. "Better watch that old bastard, or you'll find yourself in irons." Bolton, always composed, inclined his head. "Or worse, beware of traps, my lord. He may think we're desperate. Let him see that we are not." Robb nodded. In truth, he felt a stirring of youthful indignation that he even had to court Walder Frey's whims. He was Lord of Winterfell, the king in the north as his men had declared him after news of Ned Stark's captivity. Yet it was no time for pride alone. He needed the crossing. With a small retinue, including his mother, Grey Wind by his side, and a handful of guards, Robb proceeded to the gatehouse. The portcullis clanked up to let them pass. Grey Wind's ears were flattened against his head. The dire wolf padded silently, casting flickering shadows against the stone walls. Inside the main hall, he found Lord Walder seated on a high-backed chair that was almost a throne, draped in furs. The ancient lord was bent and covered with liver spots, though his eyes were bright and shrewd. Around him stood a swarm of Freys, grandsons, great-grandsons, daughters, and bastards. They lined the walls and perched at tables, all half watching and half distracted by their own brood. Yet there was little doubt that Walder Frey commanded them, and behind the half-lidded gaze was a cunning that matched any Lannister. Robb inclined his head. "Lord Frey, I come on behalf of my father, Lord Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, who—" Walder Frey cut him off with a phlegmy cough. "Your father is a prisoner, or so I've heard. Not much wardening from a dungeon, is there?" He looked around for a reaction, chuckling at his own joke. "A sorry state of affairs. And you've come to beg crossing from me." He hacked into a kerchief. "Ha, well, the Starks never did me a good turn. And now you need old Walder." Catelyn Stark tried to smooth the mood. "My lord, this is no time for rancor. There is a war to fight. Your liege lord, my brother Edmure, stands besieged in Riverrun by the Lannisters. We ask that you honor the bond of our houses." Walder snorted. "You come to me with talk of bonds. Tully bonds, Stark bonds. Oh yes, I recall your father, Lord Hoster Tully, ignoring me for so many years. I recall the wedding feasts I invited him to, the proposals for marriage alliances, all slighted or half-heartedly answered. And I see no wedding ring on your son's hand promising me a bride from the north. Do you think I'll just open my gates for sweet courtesy alone?" The tension in the hall was thick enough to choke on. Robb's knuckles tightened against his belt. He was not the type to stand and suffer insults, but he had to think of the war of the crossing. He opened his mouth to speak, but Walder Frey continued in that coarse voice. "I want terms," Lord Frey spat. "If I'm to help you, I want terms. Promises. Hostages. I know the ways of war, boy. You would use my bridge and then scurry off, leaving me to the Lannisters' wrath. And if I do let you pass, what do I get? You call yourself king in the north, do you not? Then pay your price to the twins." His watery eyes glittered with a certain malice, and Robb realized that Walder Frey wanted to exploit his desperation, to drag out a humiliating bargain. Robb looked around the hall, noticing the armed men along the walls, men who were no strangers to violence. The Freys might not have the greatest reputation, but they were numerous, and the twins were formidable to any who tried to force the crossing. Yet, as he considered his father's captivity, the threat of Tywin Lannister, and the short supply of time, a new determination hardened within him. "We need the crossing," Robb said softly, though his voice carried across the hall. "But do not presume that makes us powerless, my lord. I come here with near 20,000 men, and I assure you, they have not marched all this way merely to beg." A hush fell. Walder Frey peered from beneath his wrinkled lids. "Are you threatening me in my own hall, boy?" Grey Wind let out a deep growl, and the shadows of Walder's brood shifted uneasily. One of the older Frey sons put a hand on his sword. Catelyn Stark spoke quickly. "Lord Walder, there is no threat intended, only facts. The North has come south to defend Riverrun and rescue Lord Eddard from injustice. We will not be turned aside. If you help us, you will have a place of honor when victory is won. If you resist, I know what happens," the old man wheezed. "When the great lords come with steel in hand." He paused and tapped his cane on the floor. "You speak of war, you speak of honor. But what is to keep House Frey safe? Tywin Lannister might not take kindly to my aiding you." He hacked another cough into his kerchief. "There is also the question of your marrying one of my granddaughters, boy. That might sweeten the pot. Perhaps 2 of them, or you could arrange some other alliances for my brood." Robb felt his cheeks flush, but he kept his composure. He looked at his mother. She was silent, lips pressed together, clearly reluctant to sign away her son's hand in marriage. duty warred with maternal protectiveness in her eyes. In that moment, Robb remembered the quiet conversation he'd had with her the night before, how she had warned him that Lord Frey would demand humiliating terms. But for the crossing, they might have to accept. However, an unexpected thought flickered in Robb's mind. If Walder Frey demanded the impossible, perhaps the time for courtesy had passed. Quietly, Robb turned to Walder Frey again. "I came offering friendship, but I see you prefer to turn friend into foe. Let me speak plainly. If you do not allow us to cross, I will take the twins by force. My men will not hesitate, old man. Then your house shall have neither friend nor bargaining chip, only the wrath of the North. And afterwards, I vow, House Frey will no longer rule here." That final statement drew a collective gasp. Catelyn reached for Robb's arm in alarm. Walder Frey's watery eyes turned cold. A handful of Frey guards stepped forward, as if to seize Robb. But the Great John placed a hand on his sword hilt, and Roose Bolton's pale eyes fixed on the nearest Frey crossbowman. Tension snapped like a taut bowstring. Grey Wind's growl deepened to a snarl that bounced off the stone walls. No one spoke for a long, searing moment. Then one of Walder Frey's older sons touched his father's shoulder. "My lord, these are dangerous times. If we help Lord Stark, we remain in good standing with the Tullus. If we refuse, who will stand with us when the war reaches our doors?" For the first time, a small seed of doubt flickered in Walder's gaze. He looked from one member of his brood to another. Even among his own kin, not all seemed eager to provoke the North. The old man coughed, spat, and then gave Robb a look that was part outrage, part grudging respect. "You speak with your father's courage, boy, but I doubt your father would have barged in like this. Do you think I fear your swords?" Robb's next words carried the weight of steel. "You should. It will be better for all of us if we remain friends. My father would have tried to avoid bloodshed, but the times have changed. I was crowned king in the North by my lords. If you side with us, I will not forget, and you will not regret it." Walder Frey's gaze lingered on Grey Wind, and then on the ranks of grim-faced Northerners. In the hush, the old man tapped his cane again, once, twice, as though measuring the moment. Finally, he gave a thin-lipped sigh. "I want safe terms for my house, and I want my share of the spoils when you win, and I want no retribution if you lose." "We intend to win," Robb said. "But if the worst comes, the North will not forget its friends. As for spoils, we can discuss that. First, open the gates and let my host pass. We have no time to waste." Lord Walder looked as though he had swallowed a bitter draught. "Very well, King in the North. You have your crossing." He turned to a younger Frey man. "Open the gates, but keep an eye on them, and I want formal terms from the King in the North himself, sealed in writing. No slighting me later." The talk of formal terms might have gone on for hours. Walder listing conditions, Robb parrying, Catelyn trying to find a middle ground. But the presence of 20,000 men outside the walls gave the old lord little true leverage. The Greatjon's booming laughter echoed dangerously every time a Frey demanded too much, and Roose Bolton's quiet stares did nothing to reassure them. In the end, a short agreement was struck. The crossing would be permitted without delay. The Freys would remain under the protection of House Stark and House Tully, and in return, Robb vowed to consider a future marriage alliance once the war was settled. He made no binding promise, only a careful evasion that left Walder Frey sputtering in annoyance but unwilling to risk open conflict. With that done, the gates opened. That evening, the northern host streamed through the twins. Robb kept his men disciplined, forbidding pillaging or harassment. Many northerners expected a fight, but to their surprise, they were waved across by Frey men-at-arms. Some Freys seemed relieved at the show of restraint. Others looked sullen at being strong-armed into cooperation. By nightfall, the entire host stood on the southern bank, making camp. The battle lust that had filled them before the potential siege began to subside, replaced by the tension of the next inevitable confrontation with the Lannisters. Word traveled swiftly through the camp. Robb Stark had forced Walder Frey to yield. Men whispered that this young wolf had the cunning of a man twice his years. Others said it was the might of the North that had cowed the Freys, who preferred to switch allegiances easily to save their own skins. Whatever the truth, the crossing was secured without the humiliating betrothal or exchanging of hostages. Robb felt relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that Walder Frey was not one to forgive or forget. The old man might have been forced to kneel for now, but he would brood on the slight. Yet necessity demanded no less. Before dawn, the host broke camp and advanced toward Riverrun. Robb rode at the head with Grey Wind and the other lords. The Great John boomed triumphantly, "Let the lions hear of this. Let them tremble when they see we bend the likes of Walder Frey to our cause. Their gold won't save them from northern steel." Roose Bolton was more measured in his praise. "You've shown them that the North is no meek supplicant, my lord, but be wary of the Freys in the future. They will not forget your threats." Robb nodded. "I'll be wary, my lord of the Dreadfort, but for now we have a war to fight." They pressed south, moving quickly along the river roads, outriders scouting ahead for Lannister patrols. Soon they learned that Tywin Lannister had moved westward with a great force, while Jaime Lannister besieged Riverrun. Edmure Tully was holding out, but supplies were running short. If Robb did not break the siege swiftly, Riverrun might fall. The thought of losing his mother's home, his grandfather's seat, spurred him onward. The next days were a flurry of preparation and planning. Scouts brought word that Jaime Lannister had built siege lines around Riverrun, but his force was not large enough to face a sudden assault from outside. The young wolf recognized his opportunity. The Lannisters had divided their strength. Tywin was rumored to be heading north, likely expecting Robb to remain trapped behind the twins or trying to cross at some other point. He did not count on the king in the north forcing Walder Frey's compliance so swiftly. Robb saw a chance to catch Jaime unawares. With advice from Roose Bolton and the Great John, he devised a plan to fall upon the Lannister camp and break their siege. On a crisp morning, under gray skies that promised rain, the northern army reached the outskirts of Riverrun's territory. The land was scarred by war, fields burned or abandoned, small folk displaced. Scattered Lannister outriders occasionally skirmished with Robb's vanguard, but none got away to raise an alarm. Bolton's men were too quick and too cruel, rarely leaving survivors. By midday, the Stark forces were in position. The Tully garrison, seeing their arrival from the battlements, sent up cheers. The Golden Lions encircling Riverrun soon realized the trap. Jaime Lannister, outraged by the sudden appearance of a Northman host, mounted a desperate defense. But Robb had timed his attack well. He sent a contingent led by Ser Brynden Blackfish Tully, who had slipped out from Riverrun at great risk, to harass one flank of the Lannister lines, while the Great John and Robb led the main charge on the other. At the same time, smaller groups of archers and light cavalry circled from behind, cutting off escape routes. The Tully garrison sallied forth from Riverrun's gates, smashing into the Lions' rearguard. Horns echoed across the green fields. The clash of steel and screams of men reverberated over the river. Grey Wind bounded ahead of Robb's knights, sowing terror among the Lannister men. The Great John's booming war cries roared above the din. Once the initial shock had passed, the Lannister lines tried to form a defensive circle, but the plan shattered when Bolton's men broke through their center with a volley of crossbow bolts followed by a brutal charge. Jaime himself tried to rally his knights near the western portion of the encampment, but a wave of Tully armsmen from Riverrun hammered into them from the rear. Robb led from the front, sword in hand. He had never felt more alive or terrified. The chaos of battle swirled around him, men dying in mud and blood, horses screaming, the air heavy with the stench of fear. His direwolf was a silver-gray blur, jaws snapping. He caught a glimpse of Jaime's gilded armor through the crush of bodies. The Kingslayer fought like a demon, roaring challenges, cutting down any man who dared face him. Robb spurred his horse forward. Their gazes locked for a moment across the fray. Then Roose Bolton's troops surged between them, scattering Jaime's retinue. Robb lost sight of the Kingslayer in the melee. It was only much later, after the carnage had ebbed, that word reached him. The Kingslayer had been captured by a small band of Northmen led by one of Bolton's trusted captains. The famed Jaime Lannister, slayer of the Mad King, pinned beneath half a dozen men. He was still alive, cursing, bleeding from a gash on his brow. A tremendous uproar rose as the Lannister banners went down, one after another. The victory was total. Many Lannisters lay dead, and more taken captive. Those who managed to flee the field were harried and scattered beyond rescue. By late afternoon, the gates of Riverrun stood wide to welcome Robb Stark and his victorious host. Edmure Tully and the Blackfish embraced him, praising the young wolf's boldness. Catelyn wept tears of relief. The men roared Robb's name, proclaiming him the hero who broke the siege. Even the great Jon, who had expected a fierce battle, was awed by how swiftly the Lannisters collapsed once the circle tightened. In the Grand Hall of Riverrun, the captains and lords gathered to celebrate, though the mood was tempered by the knowledge that Ned Stark remained in captivity. The sight of Jaime Lannister, bruised and sullen, dragged before them in chains, sparked a frenzy of calls for revenge. Some demanded his head for treason, for the attempted murder of Bran Stark, for the slaying of King Aerys, for every other sin the Lannisters had visited upon the realm. But Catelyn, trembling in rage at the man who had harmed her family, spoke up nonetheless. If we kill him, we lose our one hold over the Lannisters. Sansa and Arya remain in their grasp, and my lord husband as well. She swallowed hard, drawing strength from the memory of Ned's unwavering honor. We must keep him alive. Some, like the great Jon, grumbled. Blood for blood, he growled. But he did not go against Robb's word. Robb nodded in agreement with his mother. He'll remain our prisoner. I will not risk my sisters or my father on the head of Jaime Lannister. And so the Kingslayer was tossed into Riverrun cells, heavily guarded. His presence cast a long shadow over the triumphant feast that followed. Still, for one night, the Northmen and Tully forces indulged in a measure of celebration. The siege was broken, and Robb had proven himself a brilliant commander, outmaneuvering Tywin's plans by forcing the twins and surprising Jaime. Songs were sung of the young wolf's cunning. Lords from the Vale, the Riverlands, and even a smattering of Stormlanders marveled that a boy lord of the North had done what armies of great lords often failed to do. Amid the toasts, Lord Edmure Tully spoke with Robb at length in the corner of the hall. Your crossing at the twins was a stroke of genius, Edmure said, clapping Robb on the back. I have never heard of Walder Frey letting a man pass so easily. The old scoundrel must have demanded a stiff price. Robb shrugged. I offered him much, but not all that he wanted. It was enough. Edmure was clearly curious, but he did not press. It was best no one dwell on the threats that had been made, especially since many lords might bristle at the idea of forcibly seizing a bannerman's seat. Still, the question hovered. Would Walder Frey remain loyal, or would he nurse a grudge? For weeks, the question was set aside as news poured in from the rest of the war. Tywin Lannister was on the move, responding to the rout at Riverrun by trying to consolidate his forces at Harrenhal. The formidable fortress would give him a strategic center to strike against the Riverlands or the Vale or even the Crownlands. Meanwhile, King's Landing was under Joffrey's rule, with Queen Cersei orchestrating her manipulations. Ned Stark remained their prisoner, threatened with execution if the North did not yield. But with Jaime in Stark hands, there was at least a parity of hostages. Robb called a war council in Riverrun, inviting lords from the North, the Riverlands, and any who would answer the call against Lannister aggression. The hall was crowded. Edmure Tully chaired the meeting with Robb, while Brynden the Blackfish offered keen insight into the local terrain. Roose Bolton stood quietly at Robb's flank, occasionally interjecting with chilling calm. Lords Bracken and Blackwood were also in attendance, glaring at each other across the table. The Greyjohn's booming voice broke the tension more than once with hearty calls for immediate battle. Catelyn watched carefully, wary of the intrigues that might arise among the fractious river lords. At that meeting, they determined that Tywin's hold on Harrenhal could not be ignored. The fortress was near impregnable, but the surrounding lands could be made barren, cutting off supplies. Bolton proposed a slow siege. The Great Jon favored a daring assault to crush Tywin once and for all. Others worried about the condition of the small folk and the farmland. Robb listened to every position, gleaning advice. Finally, he proposed a compromise. "We will harass Tywin's forces, cut off roads and supply lines, and ensure Harrenhal becomes his prison rather than his refuge," he said. "If he marches out to do battle, we will choose the ground and let him dash his strength against our spears. In the meantime, we negotiate with the crown for my father's release and the safety of my sisters. We hold Jaime as our greatest bargaining chip." The plan was cautious yet flexible. Brynden the Blackfish approved, praising Robb's prudence. The council agreed, and they set about dispatching forces to fortify certain strategic crossings, burning the fields around Harrenhal so the Lannisters could not forage easily. Meanwhile, envoys were sent to King's Landing, demanding Ned's release, the safe return of Sansa and Arya, and the recognition of the North's autonomy, all in exchange for Jaime Lannister's eventual ransom. It was a bold set of demands, but they had leverage now. As the war turned into a waiting game, Walder Frey's presence began to loom again. Raven messengers reported that House Frey was rattled by Robb's sudden crossing, with many in the family split on whether to fully throw in with him or secretly treat with Tywin. Lord Walder had not taken kindly to Robb's threat, but fear might keep him in line, at least for the moment. Still, Roose Bolton's men suggested that the old lord might attempt sabotage if a better opportunity arose. Rumors abounded that Tywin had sent gold to the twins, or that certain Freysians were negotiating behind Walder's back. Robb recognized a viper's nest when he saw one. He sent a few trusted men to watch the Freys closely. The memory of how Walder had demanded humiliating terms, the way he had coughed and seethed in the hall, lingered like a bad taste. Would the old man let it go, or was he merely biding his time? Despite the swirling tensions, weeks of uneasy stalemate followed. Harrenhal's black towers loomed on the horizon. Tywin Lannister snarled behind those walls, sending out raiding parties that were promptly ambushed or harried back by northern outriders. Still, no side could claim a decisive blow. King's Landing responded to the Stark demands with insults and refusals at first, claiming that Ned Stark was a confessed traitor under the duress of the throne's threats. Negotiations stalled. The realm braced for a protracted war, and behind the scenes, new alliances began to form. In Riverrun Solar, Catelyn confided in Robb that they might need a marriage alliance to bring in more southern support. Perhaps House Tyrell, House Redwyne, or even smaller houses in the Reach or the Stormlands. Robb understood the necessity of forging alliances but chafed at the notion of marriage as a bargaining tool. He also remembered Walder Frey's demands for a marriage arrangement. Better to find an alliance that benefited the war than pander to the Freys again, he thought. He continued to press the crown for Ned's release. Jaime Lannister languished in a tower cell, unrepentant and mocking whenever questioned. "You may keep me here," he told Robb once, "but my father will lay the North to ruins if you harm a hair on my head." Robb met that threat with a chilly stare. He did not reveal that Tywin had already lost half his might at Riverrun and was locked away in Harrenhal. The tide had turned, and everyone knew it. Yet King's Landing still believed Tywin an unstoppable force. News traveled slowly, and rumors were twisted. Then, a raven arrived bearing a dire piece of information. Eddard Stark had been put on trial before the Iron Throne, forced to confess to treason under threat to Sansa's life. King Joffrey, in a move that shocked even some of his advisors, had declared that Ned's crimes could only be washed away in blood. Queen Cersei had tried to intervene, or so the whispers said, but Joffrey gave the order. They had beheaded Eddard Stark in front of the Great September. The letter from Sansa, heartbreakingly naive and forced, begged Robb to end his rebellion and swear fealty to her beloved King Joffrey, so that she and Arya might be spared further harm. Robb locked himself away when he learned the news, consumed by grief and fury. He had failed to save his father. Every plan, every negotiation was moot. The Lannisters had killed him, and who knew what had happened to Arya? Sansa was a hostage. The implications racked his mind. Outside his closed door, the lords murmured anxiously. Some demanded immediate vengeance. Catelyn Stark was beyond tears, silent in her devastation. The next day, when Robb emerged, something hard and resolute gleamed in his eyes. His father was gone, but the war was far from over. At a hastily convened gathering in Riverrun's Great Hall, Robb announced that there would be no more negotiations with Joffrey Baratheon or Cersei Lannister. "They have shown their true colors," he said. His voice was thick with suppressed emotion, but unyielding. "My father is dead, murdered after a false trial. My sisters remain captives. The Lannisters have broken every vow of honor. We shall not treat with them further." Men roared their approval, slamming fists to the tables. The Great Jon bellowed, "Aye, King in the North." Even Edmure Tully, who had hoped for a diplomatic solution, stood in agreement. Only Roose Bolton said little, observing the fury around him with hooded eyes. That day, the Northern Lords and their Riverland allies renewed their vow to make Robb Stark king in the North. Hostility toward House Lannister escalated to a fever pitch. All that remained was to crush Tywin, secure the North, and free the girls if they still lived. Ravens flew far and wide, proclaiming that the king in the North would avenge Eddard Stark. The war was no longer about negotiated settlements. The time for full-scale conflict had come. Yet with grief came the need to be watchful. A letter soon arrived from Walder Frey, filled with official condolences, stale and insincere. The old lord lamented Ned Stark's death, denounced the Lannisters, and declared continued loyalty to Robb's cause. But there were lines in the letter that made Robb's stomach twist with anger. Walder Frey reminded him that if the war continued, he expected compensation for any losses to House Frey. He also reminded Robb of the promise to arrange a marriage alliance in due course. The letter concluded with a polite question about whether the king in the North would like to station some men at the Twins to secure it further. Robb read those words in a cold fury. Did Walder Frey imagine that the time was ripe to extract more concessions? Or was he hinting at a betrayal if not kept satisfied? Bolton was the one who said quietly, "We should keep a sharp eye on the Twins. If Walder tries to play both sides, we must be ready to strike first." Plan formed in Robb's mind. He summoned a small, select group of lords: Bolton, the Great Jon, Blackfish Brynden, and Catelyn. After a lengthy discussion, they resolved that leaving the Twins unguarded was too great a risk. If Walder Frey betrayed them while Robb was engaged at Harrenhal or elsewhere, the supply routes to the north would be threatened, and retreat might become impossible. They needed the Twins firmly under Stark control. But how to do that without sparking open conflict? If Walder's men resisted, it would be war at the crossing. Catelyn, still reeling from Ned's death, spoke in a measured tone. "We cannot afford another front. Walder Frey commands enough men to slow us if he chooses, and we have other battles to fight. But we can't trust him not to open his gates to the Lannisters, especially now that father is gone." The Great Jon offered a blunt solution. Take the Twins by storm, string old Walder from the battlements, see who sides with him then. Bolton smiled thinly. That would earn us no friends in the Riverlands, especially among the smaller houses who fear your might. Could push them away thinking we're tyrants. And if Tywin hears House Frey was destroyed, he might spin it as the king in the north turning on his own bannermen. Robb listened, torn between the need for decisive action and the political dangers. But in the end, it was Brynden Tully who suggested a compromise. Occupy the Twins with a strong garrison, not necessarily kill Walder. Place him under watch for the duration of the war. Let him keep his title for the time being, but make it clear that any betrayal means his entire line is forfeit. Robb considered that carefully, then nodded. "We go north again, then. I will lead a portion of the army to secure the Twins. Once that is done, the rest of you can continue harrying Tywin at Harrenhal. If the Lannisters move east, so be it, we'll handle that as well. But first, we end this Frey question." They decided that Bolton would remain in the Riverlands, overseeing the siege lines around Harrenhal with Edmure Tully. The Great Jon would accompany Robb north, along with the Blackfish, to ensure that Walder Frey complied. The plan was set. Ravens flew with messages to the Twins, announcing that the king in the north and a portion of his host would arrive to fortify the crossing against Lannister threats. Walder Frey was instructed to prepare for their arrival. The tone of the letter was polite but firm. Catelyn insisted on a softened approach, hoping to minimize bloodshed. Yet the underlying meaning was unmistakable. House Stark was coming to occupy the twins. When they rode north, Robb brought 10,000 men, a force large enough to crush any Frey resistance. Another few thousand, mostly cavalry, trailed behind as reserves. He left 5,000 with Bolton near Riverrun, trusting the cunning lord's skill in siege warfare. The march up the river roads was somber. Men remembered how they had first forced the crossing under threat, and many wondered if this time the twins would bar the gates. But Robb was resolute. Catelyn traveled with him for part of the journey, though grief still weighed her down. She had lost her father, Hoster Tully, not long before, and now her husband as well. Her concern for Sansa and Arya was a constant ache. But she set her mind on the tasks ahead, counseling Robb on the complexities of dealing with Walder Frey. The Blackfish rode beside her at times, a silent pillar of support. The Great John, by contrast, was boisterous as ever, entertaining the troops with wild tales, eager to bring the old weasel to heel. When the host finally arrived within sight of the twins, the soldiers fanned out into formation. The banners of Stark, Tully, and their allies fluttered in a strong breeze. This time, they saw the gates open and a column of Frey riders come forth to greet them, carrying a large white banner indicating parley. Ser Ryman Frey, one of Walder's older grandsons, led the procession. He had a nervous look about him, though he attempted a show of confidence. He addressed Robb with a bow, forced smile on his thin lips. "My lord, your grace, House Frey welcomes you once more to the twins. My grandsire asks that you enter in peace, so that we might discuss how best to strengthen this essential crossing." Robb studied Ser Ryman. The man's stiff posture and darting eyes betrayed fear, and the troops behind him did not look eager for a fight. It confirmed that Walder Frey had no stomach for open defiance. The old lord must have realized that if he refused, the fortress would fall. Even so, Robb doubted the sincerity of their welcome. He responded with calm authority. "We come to defend our crossing, as we informed your lord grandsire. We have brought sufficient men to ensure the Lannisters cannot assail the twins unopposed. Lead me to Lord Walder." So, under the watchful eye of northern spears, the Frey riders led Robb's vanguard through the gates. The rest of the army followed in a disciplined march, occupying the wide yards and towers with practiced efficiency. The Greatjon's men, large and imposing, took positions along the ramparts, side by side with uneasy Frey guards. The Frey smallfolk peered from windows and doorways, uncertain whether this meant liberation or conquest. Walder Frey waited in the hall as before, though this time the atmosphere was heavy with the knowledge that his fortress was effectively surrounded. Robb entered with Grey Wind pacing at his side and the Great John, the Blackfish, and a retinue of sworn swords trailing behind. Walder Frey sat in his high seat. He looked older than before, if such a thing was possible, and his lips were twisted in a bitter smile. So, the king in the north returns to old Walder's seat with half the north in tow. His voice was rasping, almost lost to phlegm. "Are we to greet you as friend or foe this day?" "As friend, if you remain loyal," Robb said, no room for ambiguity in his tone. "We have reason to believe that the Lannisters might attempt to bribe or threaten you. I will not risk such treachery. Therefore, I am placing a contingent of my men here to garrison the twins. They will ensure that no Lannister host passes, and that no messages to the Lannisters leave these walls." Walder Frey's mouth opened and closed. A wave of anger spread across his wrinkled features. "A garrison? You would hold my castle as if I were some disobedient child? You have never faced war like this before," Robb cut in sharply. "The Lannisters have shown they will murder and betray at will. My father is dead, my sisters captives. We cannot allow any chance that the twins fall into enemy hands or that vital intelligence about our plans is sold to them." Walder Frey's bony fingers curled around the arms of his seat. He hacked a cough, then glowered. "So be it. Do I have a choice? You brought an army to my gates, again. Perhaps you would prefer to name me your prisoner, if that suits your purposes." Robb studied the old man's face. "If you give me no cause to suspect betrayal, you will remain Lord of the Crossing, free to manage your own affairs. But from this day, the twins stand under the direct protection of the king in the north. My men will share these walls with yours. I expect no trouble, or there will be consequences." A pin could have dropped in the silence that followed. Frey eyes darted about, from the Gretchen's massive form to the men-at-arms wearing Stark colors. Lord Walder's face twitched, but in the end, he offered a short, defeated nod. "You are gracious. I am sure, your grace." Robb accepted the capitulation without further gloating. He posted 1,000 men under the command of the Blackfish to fortify the twins. The Frey guards were told to continue their duties, but each tower and gate was to be manned jointly by Frey and Stark soldiers. The arrangement was tense. Frey scions bristled at northern oversight, while the Northmen mistrusted the Freys. Still, discipline held. The Great John took to patrolling the courtyard with laughter and threats all at once, ensuring no trouble brewed among the lesser Freys. Catelyn supervised the administrative details of storing supplies, adjusting the flow of goods up and down the Trident, and ensuring small folk were not unduly harmed by the new arrangement. She was grim but competent, channeling her grief into the tasks of war. At one point, alone in the Castle Godswood, she prayed for her father and husband, for her daughter's safety, for Bran and Rickon in Winterfell, for Robb's success. The ancient trees did not answer, but the hush of leaves in the breeze felt like a quiet benediction. Walder Frey himself retreated into sullen acquiescence, seldom leaving his solar except when summoned. He complained of infirmities, muttering that the king in the north had stolen his fortress. But the truth was that he dared not openly protest while he was surrounded. Some of his brood seemed relieved, perhaps seeing in Stark protection a safeguard against Tywin. Others were resentful. A few cunning young Freys tried to ingratiate themselves with the northern captains, hinting they might be persuaded to serve as middlemen for better terms. Robb's men, well aware of Walder's duplicity, gave them no openings. Within a fortnight, the twins were secured. Robb, satisfied that the crossing would remain firmly in northern hands, began preparations to return south. Tywin Lannister was still at Harrenhal, and word had come that a force led by Ser Gregor Clegane was raiding outlying villages in the Riverrun. NDS, striking terror into the hearts of the small folk. Bolton's men had inflicted some counterattacks, but the region remained in flux. There were also rumors that Stannis Baratheon had crowned himself king on Dragonstone, while his brother Renly had done likewise in the south with a vast Reach alliance. The War of Five Kings was truly begun, and the North could not sit idle while House Frey's loyalty was in question. On the eve of his departure, Robb walked the ramparts of the Western Tower, gazing across the Trident as the sun set in a blaze of crimson. Catelyn joined him, wrapped in a heavy cloak. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the fading light. Far below, the swift currents glimmered like red steel. It reminded them too keenly of the blood that had been shed and the blood that was yet to come. "You have done well," Catelyn finally said. "Securing this crossing was no easy task, though it grieves me that it had to be done by force." Robb's expression was distant. If Walder Frey had been the man Father hoped he'd be, none of this would be needed. But Father trusted in honor, and for that, he paid with his life. She placed a hand on his arm. "Do not forget your father's legacy of mercy, Robb. Honor is not a weakness unless we let our enemies twist it against us. You have shown strength. Now show wisdom." "I will, Mother, but first I will fight. I promised Father I would rescue my sisters, though I could not save him. I will finish this war." In the glow of the dying sun, Catelyn saw the face of a boy grown too fast into manhood. She nodded, tears threatening. "Then go and do what must be done. The North stands behind you." That same night, Robb left the twins, riding at the head of his army. The Great John accompanied him, eager for battle, while the Blackfish remained behind to command the garrison alongside a small retinue of Tully men, ensuring Walder Frey would not be free to scheme. The watchers on the walls saw the northern banners recede into the distance, leaving behind a new normal at the Twins. A fortress under guard, half in Frey hands, half in Stark hands, a symbol of forced submission. Walder Frey sat fuming in his solar, but the war had moved on without him. Robb's host rode south again, rejoining Bolton's contingent near the charred outskirts of Harrenhal's wide domains. Thick black towers loomed in the distance. Scouts reported that Tywin Lannister's men were numerous but low on supplies. The new plan was to encircle the fortress, cutting off any escape route, while smaller detachments roamed the countryside to corner or repel Gregor Clegane's raiders. Aware that King's Landing might send reinforcements, Robb had arranged signals and fortifications along the main roads, hoping to intercept or delay any loyalist army. War was an ever-shifting board, with multiple kings now vying for supremacy. But the North's immediate goal was clear: break the might of House Lannister and free his sisters. Word reached them that King Renly Baratheon had marched north with the might of the Reach behind him, accompanied by the beautiful young Margaery Tyrell. Another rumor claimed that King Stannis had launched a naval assault along the Blackwater. The realm was fracturing, each faction seeking advantage. Robb realized that alliances might be made if it served his cause. The Tyrells, for instance, might be amenable to a pact. The trouble was that with Ned Stark gone, King's Landing was wholly under Lannister control, and Sansa and Arya were still held fast behind those red walls. Bargaining for their freedom might require more than threats, perhaps the might of another alliance. In the weeks that followed, Harrenhal proved a tough nut to crack. Tywin was no fool. He kept most of his forces sheltered behind the massive curtain walls, sending out only small sorties to test the Northmen's lines. He was also rumored to be in negotiations with certain riverlords, promising them gold and pardons if they turned on the king in the north. Yet Robb had chosen the vantage points carefully, ensuring a ring of watchers and forts around the fortress. Supplies were scarce for Tywin, but Harrenhal had storerooms that could last some months. The war settled into a tense stalemate in this corner of the Riverlands. Meanwhile, the realm beyond continued to roil with fresh conflicts. Though no massive battle erupted immediately, the strain of the siege told on the men. Horses died, disease crept through the camps, and morale fluctuated. Winter was looming, though not yet in full force, and the nights grew longer. Robb had no illusions that his position was entirely secure. He needed to keep watch for any news from the Twins, from the north, from King's Landing. During that time, more messages arrived from Walder Frey, each letter more honeyed than the last. The old man feigned loyalty, praising the king in the north for protecting the crossing, reminding him of the potential for marriage alliances, and so on. Robb answered curtly, instructing the Blackfish to maintain tight control. At the same time, Roose Bolton carried out small raids, testing Tywin's defenses. He also sent spies into Harrenhal, if the rumors were to be believed. By increments, the noose tightened. A crucial blow came when some of Tywin's outriders attempted a breakout to gather food from a nearby region. Robb's outriders ambushed them, capturing supply wagons and scattering the Lannister scouts. Increasingly, Tywin found himself pinned behind the black walls, forced to watch as the king in the north cut away his options. Whispers from within Harrenhal spoke of low morale, desertions, even talk of mutiny among lesser lords forced to remain at Tywin's side. Yet the Lannister patriarch was formidable. No one doubted he had more plans up his sleeve. Some said he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Others suggested he was merely stalling until he could negotiate a truce with one of the other claimants to the throne. Then came a string of ravens from King's Landing, each carrying the royal seal of Joffrey Baratheon, though clearly written in Cersei's hand. They demanded the release of Jaime Lannister, threatened the public flogging of Sansa Stark, and in one letter, claimed that Arya Stark was missing from the capital. No one knew if that was true or a trick. Robb read the letters and felt his heart hammer with fear for his sisters, especially when further letters came that Sansa was still in the Red Keep, though her health depends on the king in the North's behavior. The threat was unmistakable. Fury roiled in Robb's chest. He confided in his mother, "If I attempt to ransom Jaime now, They'll sense weakness and demand more than I can give. Yet if I do nothing, they might harm Sansa. And if Arya is truly missing, where is she? What if she's out there alone? Catelyn, pale but resolute, said, "We must hold Jaime. He is the only shield we have for Sansa. We must hope the Lannisters will not risk harming her while they still want their precious Kingslayer returned." Robb wrestled with the choices. War was a monstrous game, and his father's death had shown him that the Lannisters did not balk at cruelty. Yet for all their viciousness, the Lannisters prized family above all else. Jaime was too valuable to them to be discarded easily. Sansa's well-being might yet be preserved by that fact alone. So the siege continued, the realm burned, and the nights grew ever darker. The new alliances swirling around them threatened to rewrite the future of Westeros. Still, in the shadows of Harrenhal's giant towers, the king in the north and his stalwart lords held Tywin Lannister pinned. Behind them, the twins were locked under northern garrison, Walder Frey fuming but silent. Riverrun remained free, the Tully banner flying. The war had turned, all because Robb had chosen a different path that fateful day at the twins, choosing steel instead of supplication, forcing Walder Frey to bend rather than bending himself. And so the brutal game continued. Rivals rose, allies faltered, winter loomed. Yet at each turn, the North stood unbroken, guided by a young wolf who had learned hard lessons from the loss of his father. Robb Stark's vow echoed through the hearts of his men. He would not be undone by the petty machinations of a spiteful old lord like Walder Frey. He would not bow to the cunning gold-laden demands of House Lannister. He would not abandon his sisters to their fate. He was the king in the north, and he had forced the twins to open their gates. Now, war or peace, mercy or vengeance, the choice lay in his hands. And the realm waited, breathless, to see how the young wolf's story would unfold in blood and glory upon the fields of battle. And so the brutal game continued. The siege lines around Harrenhal held firm beneath gray skies, and the Northmen settled into a cruel stalemate with Lord Tywin, whose gold and influence no longer shone so brightly from within the shadowed towers. Cold mists drifted across the waters of the nearby lake, where weeds and half-submerged ruins told of the ancient curses that plagued the castle. Some of the men muttered about ghosts roaming Harrenhal's blackened halls. From within came no sign of surrender, but no open challenge either. Outside, in the sprawling camps, the king in the north built earthen ramparts, posted sentries day and night, and waited. Waiting was the hardest part for Robb Stark. Night after night, he dreamed of Winterfell's quiet snow and remembered simpler days hunting in the Wolfswood with Jon, Theon, and his brothers. He dreamed of his father, the memory so vivid that upon waking, his grief struck anew. The nights were punctuated by the wails of wounded men, the distant howls of wolves, the rattle of campfires as the wind whipped across the muddy ground. He yearned to end this war quickly, to free Sansa, to discover Arya's fate. But he knew better than to rush headlong into Tywin's jaws. Even caged, the lion was dangerous. On a brisk morning, when the sky was heavy with clouds, Robb rode out with the Greatjon to inspect the northern lines where Lord Bolton's men had entrenchments. Frozen mud sucked at the horses' hooves. Pale-faced pikemen stamped their feet to keep warm. Snowflakes drifted lazily, melting as soon as they touched the ground. Though it was not yet the deep winter, the chill was real enough to seep through boiled leather and cloak alike. The men bowed as Robb passed, calling him Your Grace, though many still called him simply My Lord, remembering him as the boy from Winterfell. Some had known him as a child, but war was forging him into something else. They stopped at a small ridge that offered a vantage across the wide plain before Harrenhal's looming walls. From there, Robb could see the Lannister standard on the ramparts, a proud golden lion against crimson. He turned to the Greatjon. Any sign of movement? None worth naming, Umber grunted, thick breath steaming in the cold air. A few outriders tried to slip out under cover of darkness 2 nights past, but our scouts harried them back to the gates. We took some crossbow fire from the walls, nothing more. Robb nodded. He dismounted to walk along a short row of sharpened stakes that formed part of the outer defenses. The Greatjon followed, heavy boots crunching the frosted grass. A pair of Bolton men, one of them with a patch of flayed man on his cloak, stood on guard, dipping their heads respectfully. Although Robb had grown wary of Roose Bolton's unsettling demeanor, he had to admit the Dreadfort men were disciplined and effective. "We'll keep them penned in," Robb said, half to the Great John and half to himself. "If Tywin tries to break out, we'll crush him in open ground. If he remains inside, they starve slowly. Though I suspect Harrenhal stores are too large to run out soon." "Aye," the Great John replied, resting one meaty hand on his sword's pommel. "It's a waiting game, but we can do it. We'll see if the old lion rots in his den or comes out roaring." They pressed on, greeting men, checking fortifications. Occasionally, Robb paused to offer a word of encouragement or to consult with minor lords and captains. He was learning that a king's duty was not just strategy but presence. The men drew confidence from seeing him among them, from hearing a personal word or receiving a nod of approval. Ned Stark had taught him as much in quieter times. At midday, they returned to the command pavilion, where Roose Bolton was seated at a table, scanning a sheaf of reports with the clinical focus of a leech examining a patient. He looked up at Robb's approach and stood. "Your Grace, any new tidings from the south?" Robb asked, casting aside his damp cloak. Bolton's pale eyes gleamed. "A few. We have ravens from Riverrun, the Vale, and the Twins, nothing urgent, save for certain rumors. Also, the Lady Catelyn requests your presence in her tent at your earliest convenience." Robb frowned, seeing how Bolton's mouth twitched almost imperceptibly at the mention of rumors. "Rumors of what sort, my lord?" "The sort that might interest us, depending on your strategy. Word arrives that Stannis Baratheon has threatened King's Landing by sea, bombarding some of the smaller forts along the Blackwater Bay. Meanwhile, his brother Renly is said to be rallying support from the Reach, though it remains uncertain whether Highgarden rides north or east. The Great John scratched his beard. "The realm tears itself apart. Good. Fewer men for us to fight in the long run." "That might be so," Robb conceded, "but it could complicate alliances we might attempt. If Renly or Stannis sets aside their claims to the Iron Throne to make common cause with us, we could hasten the downfall of House Lannister." Bolton gave a thin smile. "Negotiating with either brother would require delicate timing, Your Grace, and neither is known for compromising on the matter of kingship." Robb exhaled. "We'll consider it carefully." He left Bolton and the Great John to continue sifting through intelligence, then made his way through rows of tents toward Catelyn's quarters. The camp was alive with the midday hustle. Men carrying water and firewood, blacksmiths hammering out fresh arrowheads, cooks stirring great pots of barley stew, all beneath the watchful eyes of mounted sentinels. Sentries recognized him and stood straighter. Robb felt the weight of their trust, and it pressed him forward, spurring him to find a path through the labyrinth of war. When he reached his mother's tent, the guards at the entry parted. Inside, the space was warmed by a brazier that glowed faintly red. Catelyn sat near a small table, writing by lamplight. Her shoulders still bore the slump of profound loss, but she lifted her gaze as Robb entered, and her features softened in that quiet maternal way. She set down her quill. "Robb," she greeted, her voice hushed. "I asked for you because word has come from the twins." He stiffened. "Not more demands from Walder Frey, I hope." She offered a wry half-smile. "He would not be himself if he did not demand something. But no, this is from your uncle Brynden. He reports that Lord Walder remains sullen, though peaceful. There's no sign of open rebellion among the Freys, and our men have integrated into the watch rotations. It seems stable." Robb nodded, relieved. "Good. At least that front remains quiet." "There is something else," Catelyn continued, folding her hands in her lap. "A messenger from King's Landing reached the twins first, by happenstance or design. He carried a letter from the Queen Regent, or so it claims. According to Brynden, the letter begs Walder Frey to intercede on the Lannisters' behalf, urging him to convince you to release Jaime in exchange for Sansa's safety." Robb's chest tightened at the mention of Sansa. "My mother, we've seen this threat before. If we yield now, we get nothing but the Lannisters' next betrayal. You told me so yourself. She looked down, her voice quavering slightly. I know. Still, it pains me to think what might be happening to her in that viper's nest. There's no easy remedy, Robb said, forcing calm into his words. We keep Jaime. We wait. As long as the Lannisters want him back, they'll keep Sansa alive. As for Arya, if only we knew where she is. Catelyn closed her eyes as if in prayer. If she is truly missing, perhaps she escaped. She's resourceful, that girl. Yes, Robb swallowed. I pray the gods watch over her. They spoke then of smaller matters. Supply lines, the well-being of House Mallister, who had sent word they might join the siege if the seas were safe enough to travel, and how best to handle the onset of cold weather. Through it all, the specter of Sansa's peril loomed, unspoken yet ever-present. Robb knew that if he rushed to King's Landing, he could fall into a trap. If he simply sat idle, Sansa's fate hung by a thread. Yet each passing day also drained Tywin's strength behind Harrenhal's walls. If Tywin broke, King's Landing would stand more isolated, giving Robb leverage. That was the plan. But how many would suffer in the interim? Late that afternoon, a new stir rippled through the camp. Horns sounded from the Southern Watch. A column of riders approached under a banner of golden roses. House Tyrell. Robb was initially astonished. Why would the Tyrells come this far north from Highgarden? Quickly, the camp was abuzz with speculation. Some said it must be part of Renly Baratheon's alliance, as the Tyrells had thrown in with him. Others guessed it might be an envoy. Robb sent men to the perimeter to greet them, and soon enough, they arrived at the king's command tent. A modest group of about 20 knights and their retainers, flying a white banner of parley along with the golden rose. At their head rode Ser Garland Tyrell, a lean, strong knight known for both martial skill and courtesy, overshadowed in fame by his younger brother Loras but highly respected nonetheless. Robb had the Great John, Bolton, and other lords gather in the largest pavilion to receive the visitors. The Tyrell knights were ushered in with minimal fuss, though the Northmen eyed them warily. Ser Garland wore a green surcoat emblazoned with the Tyrell rose, and he doffed his helmet to reveal a courteous smile and dark curls. At his side was a herald bearing a scroll. They bowed to Robb, acknowledging him as king in the north with a certain diplomatic grace, neither fully subservient nor openly dismissive. Your Grace, Ser Garland began, I come in the name of King Renly Baratheon and my Lord Father, Mace Tyrell, Warden of the South. We bring greetings and proposals. He glanced at the ring of northern lords and chose his words carefully. We know of your war with House Lannister. My brother Loras has had cause to hate them, as do we all, after the treacheries of King Joffrey and Queen Cersei. Robb inclined his head. You speak of King Renly, but Stannis also claims the Iron Throne by right of seniority. What do the Tyrells say to that? Ser Garland's lips tightened. Lord Stannis has chosen a path of fire and shadows, from what we hear. My father believes that Renly, by virtue of popularity and the great support of the South, is the rightful king to unite the realm. Our aim is to rid King's Landing of Lannister dominion and seat Renly on the throne. We come to you because we see a chance for mutual advantage. The North seeks justice for Ned Stark and freedom from the Lannisters. King Renly seeks the throne. We share a common enemy. The Great John crossed his arms, scowling. That might be so, but we have already crowned our own king, our young wolf. We do not bow to any Southron king now. A hush fell, but Ser Garland did not appear offended. I understand your pride and your cause. The rumor in the South is that the North has declared independence. King Renly recognizes that, if it helps bring the Lannisters down. Indeed, we are prepared to discuss a formal alliance, to see you confirmed as king in the North if you will support Renly's claim to the Iron Throne. With your armies joined, we can strike at Harrenhal or bypass it, and march on King's Landing, end the Lannisters and rescue your sister. Robb kept his face neutral, though his heart beat faster at the prospect. An alliance of kings. The realm has never seen such a thing. How do I know Renly will keep his word once the Lannisters are beaten? Ser Garland spread his hands. King Renly proposes a binding treaty, sealed by marriage if need be, though he also offers alternative means of guaranteeing good faith. And consider that if we do not unite, the war may drag on, giving Tywin Lannister time to recover. Or Stannis, who may well attempt to claim the throne by force of arms, and who might not recognize your kingdom's independence so readily. The mention of marriage pricked Robb's memory. He recalled how Walder Frey had demanded a bride for one of his countless brood. He also remembered that some men had suggested forging a new alliance with the Tyrells or others. Could this be the moment? In the hush, Bolton's voice cut through, mild and cool. The king in the north must consider carefully. He has been crowned by the northern lords. Would they accept any compromise with a Baratheon on the Iron Throne? Ser Garland nodded with measured deference. We do not ask you to bend the knee to Renly in the old sense, only to coordinate efforts. The precise terms can be negotiated, but the Tyrells come with open hands. We have tens of thousands of swords. We can combine them with yours, your grace. Robb studied the man carefully. Tell me, Ser Garland, why come here to Harrenhal's doorstep, rather than sending a raven? This is bold. He gave a small smile. We wanted to show sincerity, and if you accept, we can strike swiftly, before Tywin Lannister is prepared. Our outriders are not far from here. King Renly himself is encamped near Bitterbridge. If you will join, he will advance north with the main Tyrell host, while your men encircle Harrenhal from the west. We can trap Tywin between two armies, or even cut him off from the route to King's Landing. The tent filled with the rustle of men exchanging looks. Many saw the advantage, but Robb felt a pang. If he marched on King's Landing with Renly, what of Sansa's safety? Would the Lannisters use her as a shield? Yet if the combined armies of Stark and Tyrell crushed Tywin, the city might surrender, and he could liberate his sister at once. And what if Stannis attacked from the sea, creating a three-front war for the Lannisters? That could end it all swiftly, but it could also create chaos, with too many kings jostling for the spoils. Robb took a steadying breath. Ser Garland, I will not give you a final answer on the spot. I must speak with my closest lords, consider all the angles. For now, take our hospitality. We will give you a reply on the morrow. Ser Garland bowed. Thank you, your grace. We are at your service. They left, escorted to comfortable pavilions for rest. The moment the Tyrell party was gone, a heated discussion erupted among Robb's council. Some lords, like the Great John, were inclined to say the North needed no help. But others, including some river lords, believed an alliance with the Tyrells might shorten the war considerably. Roose Bolton, in his quiet way, pointed out that the Lannisters were not the only threat. If we bleed ourselves on Tywin's walls, Renly might sweep in to claim the spoils. Better to share the victory now, and keep a watchful eye on them later. Catelyn, on the other hand, was torn. If we ally with Renly, might he not use Sansa as a bargaining chip once King's Landing falls? Or perhaps they'll see that she remains a valuable hostage to keep the North from drifting away. Many pitfalls remain. Robb closed his eyes for a moment. He felt the weight of the crown in more ways than one. His mother's misgivings were valid, but an alliance could indeed give them the force they needed to smash Tywin and free Sansa. At length, he spoke quietly. We must weigh the risk of letting Tywin remain holed up, always a threat from behind, while the Lannisters hold my sister in the Red Keep. If Renly's approach is genuine, it could break the war wide open. The council argued into the night. Ultimately, they agreed to meet again in the morning, after each lord had time to consult with his men and consider the ramifications. Robb left them to their thoughts and retreated to a small tent he used for solitude, near the edge of the encampment. Gray wind dozed outside, the direwolf's ears twitching in the winter breeze. Inside, by the light of a single lantern, Robb tried to lose himself in maps. But all he saw was the fork of possibilities before him. Ally with Renly or refuse. Attack Harrenhal or outlast it. Negotiate for Sansa or trust in threats. The edges of the map blurred in his vision, and his father's face came to him unbidden. Ned Stark, whose counsel always cut through confusion with honest steel. Forgive me, father, for I am young at this, but I will do what I must." Eventually, restless and unable to sleep, Robb donned a cloak and stepped outside to walk among the slumbering tents. Snow drifted in small flurries, blanketing the ground. Dim torches burned here and there, and the soft murmur of the night watch hummed along the lines. From across a field, he could see the enormous silhouette of Harrenhal, the jagged towers like a row of fangs against the moonlit sky. He knew that within those walls, Tywin was equally haunted by the shape of the war. Perhaps the old lion paced the black halls, seething over how the young wolf had cornered him. Or perhaps Tywin slept soundly, trusting in cunning plans to shift the balance. The next dawn, the lords gathered again. Ser Garland Tyrell and a few of his knights also attended, at Robb's invitation, though they stood politely aside as the Northerners hashed out their final stance. Ultimately, the majority of Robb's council favored opening negotiations with Renly. The potential to crush Tywin swiftly was too great a boon to dismiss. Still, caution rang in every voice. They would not become Renly's subjects. They would fight as equals. Should Renly or the Tyrells treat the North with disrespect, the deal would be off. Ser Garland, when asked if his king would accept such terms, smiled and answered that King Renly was eager for exactly that. A grand coalition that would break Lannister power once and for all. So it was decided. Robb would march south with a portion of his army, enough to meet Renly's host near the Blackwater, while leaving the rest to maintain the siege of Harrenhal under Roose Bolton's command. This partial departure from the siege was risky, as Tywin might seize the chance to break out, but Bolton was confident he could hold the ring. And if Tywin tried, it might draw him into open battle, where the Northerners could have the advantage. In the best scenario, Tywin might remain pinned while Robb and Renly overran King's Landing or forced a hasty Lannister retreat. The details were uncertain, but that was war. No plan survived untouched by chaos. Before he left, Robb paid a visit to Jaime Lannister in the makeshift dungeon they had constructed in a stone outbuilding near the edge of the camp. The structure, once a stable, had been converted into a secure cell with iron bars. 2 of Bolton's most loyal men stood guard at the entrance, men rumored to have flayed the skin from bandits in the Dreadfort. Jaime sat on a rough wooden bench behind the bars, still wearing a chain that tethered one ankle to a bolt in the floor. Despite that indignity, the Kingslayer exuded a certain careless bravado. When Robb appeared, Jaime rose. "Your Grace," he said with a mocking bow, "to what do I owe this honor? Have you decided to ransom me at last?" Robb's face remained impassive. "Not at present. I came to see if you had any messages you wish carried to your family." Jaime smirked. "My father knows how to read a battlefield. As for my dear sister, I suspect she's quite busy with her boy king. Give them both my love if you would." He lowered his voice slightly. "And how is your dear sister? Have you heard word from King's Landing? A little bird told me the Lannisters hold her quite close." Robb refused to take the bait, though anger burned in his chest. "She is alive. For her sake, you yet draw breath." Jaime's lips twisted. "A father's head and a daughter's captivity. All because you insist on playing king. I suppose you've done rather well, haven't you?" His tone was mocking, but beneath it lurked something else. Unease, perhaps. Even Jaime must have realized the war was not going in the Lannisters' favor. "You will remain here," Robb said flatly. "If my sister is harmed, I promise you, Kingslayer, you'll curse your mother for ever bringing you into this world." He turned on his heel and left Jaime there, the sound of the Kingslayer's bitter laughter echoing behind. Every step away from that cell felt heavy. Still, it hardened Robb's resolve. For Sansa, for Arya, he would do anything to end Lannister rule. Within days, preparations for the southern march were complete. A large contingent, near 10,000 strong, left Harrenhal's outskirts, including cavalry, archers, and foot soldiers from various northern houses. With them rode the king in the north himself, the great John Rickard Karstark, still mourning his sons lost to the Lannisters, and other notable lords. Ser Garland Tyrell guided them along roads that had been scouted by Tyrell outriders, promising a rendezvous with Renly's main force near the Blackwater Rush. Meanwhile, Roose Bolton remained behind with around 8,000 men to keep Harrenhal surrounded, aided by some of the riverlords who deemed it prudent to hold Tywin in place. Robb's departure from the siege lines was a sight. The horses kicked up slush and mud, the banners rippled in the bitter wind, and horns sounded doleful notes. He lingered near the rear of the departing host, exchanging final words with Bolton, who stood in the swirl of falling snow like a pale wraith. "Keep your ravens ready," Robb told him, adjusting the collar of his cloak. "If Tywin stirs in any way, you must let us know." Bolton bowed, that eerie glint in his eyes. "Of course, your grace. Good fortune ride with you. May the old gods and the new favor your quest." They shook hands stiffly, and Robb spurred his horse. Gray wind raced ahead, forging a path among the throng. Before him lay the rolling plains and river roads leading south. Each mile took him farther from Harrenhal's gloom and closer to the uncertain clash of kings that would decide the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. For many days they traveled south, sometimes passing through villages deserted by war, other times greeted by local lords or landed knights who might come out to see the king in the north. Some offered minor tribute or shared news of outlaws and bandits. All seemed wary of the broadening conflict. Robb's men kept discipline, refraining from looting, mindful of their king's orders to protect small folk when possible. Along the way, Ser Garland Tyrell and his knights would ride ahead and then return, scouting for signs of Lannister or Crown forces. They reported little movement, likely because so many of Tywin's men were pinned at Harrenhal, and the rest were scattered or engaged near King's Landing. As the Northmen advanced, they caught glimpses of the devastation left by Gregor Clegane's marauders. Burned farmsteads, slaughtered livestock, half-ruined holdfasts. Women wept at the roadside, begging for mercy or food. Robb ordered supplies to be shared where possible, though the army had only so much to spare. When they crossed certain streams, the waters were fouled with ash and corpses. Even the Greyjoy's hardy spirit grew grim at the sights. The men mumbled darkly about the mountain that rides. If they caught him, there would be a reckoning. Eventually, the northern host turned southeast, following the path Ser Garland indicated. The land grew greener, the climate milder, and the roads busier. Columns of refugees flowed in the opposite direction, many fleeing the approach of King Renly's grand host from the Reach. Robb's outriders encountered only sporadic skirmishes, small groups of brigands or stray Lannister stragglers. No pitched battles occurred. By the time they drew near the agreed meeting place, an ancient stone bridge spanning a tributary of the Blackwater, the scouts brought word that a vast Tyrell encampment awaited them around the next bend. Robb's men emerged onto a broad plain, and there they beheld the banners of the Reach in astonishing number. A sea of green and gold stretched along gentle hills, with the golden rose of Tyrell blooming on countless pennants, alongside the stag of Baratheon. Colorful pavilions ringed the perimeter, and thousands upon thousands of soldiers moved like ants around cooking fires and watch lines. Robb found himself marveling at the sheer scale. He had not realized the Tyrells had mustered so many men. There might be 30,000 or more. It was as large an army as he had ever seen, dwarfing even the force with which he had left the north. A party of highborn knights and lords soon rode out to greet them, at whose head was the king himself, Renly Baratheon. He wore a splendid set of armor inlaid with gold filigree, and a crown shaped like golden antlers upon his head. A charming smile curved his lips, and the wind teased at his dark hair. Beside him rode Margaery Tyrell, his newlywed queen, clad in rich green fabrics that shimmered in the sunlight. On Renly's other side was Ser Loras Tyrell in gleaming armor, the Knight of Flowers, with plumes dancing from his helm. Their retinue gleamed like a royal procession. Robb reined in his horse, the Great John and his other lords forming up behind him. The young king of the north regarded the young king of the south. Both were in their late teens, though Renly was older by some years, and both wore the confidence of men used to command. For a moment, the hush of anticipation lay over the field. Then Renly cantered forward, raising a hand in greeting. "King Robb Stark," he called, a bright ring in his voice. "I bid you welcome. I see that Ser Garland spoke true of your strength." He eyed the ranks of Northmen with interest, and at the sight of Grey Wind padding alongside Robb's horse, Renly's smile became tinged with curiosity. The famous direwolf of House Stark, is it not? Robb inclined his head. His name is Grey Wind. He has a taste for lion meat. That remark earned a murmur of approval from the Northmen behind him. Renly laughed easily. May he soon have his fill. The Lannisters have plagued us long enough. Come, our camp is open to you. Let us set aside old boundaries and share bread and salt as allies. He waved them forward. Knights parted to either side, revealing the route into the Tyrell encampment. Thus commenced a scene of near feasting. The Tyrells had abundant provisions, wagons of fruits and grains from the reach, casks of wine from the arbor, salted meats, cheeses, and more. Robb's men, hardened by months in the field, looked on in amazement at the bounty. Though wariness remained, Renly's easy charm and the courtesy of the Tyrell lords helped break the ice. They established a large communal area in the center of the camp, where the two kings' tables would stand side by side. That night, a grand banquet was held beneath the starry sky, braziers blazing, musicians playing lively tunes. Even the great John laughed with Tyrell bannermen, and Marjorie Tyrell flitted among the gathered nobles, praising their bravery and dropping gracious compliments as though scattering rose petals. Yet behind the masks of courtesy, the question of terms hovered like a hidden dagger. At last, after the feast, Robb and Renly retired with their closest advisors to a richly furnished command tent. There, they spread out maps on a large oaken table. Roaring braziers kept the night chill at bay. Renly removed his crown and set it aside, as if to emphasize a spirit of cooperation. Robb kept his own simple circlet of bronze and iron, newly fashioned in the style of the ancient kings of winter. I have heard of your father's fate, my lord. Renly began, his tone gentler than before. Ned Stark was an honorable man. I regret that I never had the chance to know him better. Robb's face hardened. I appreciate the sentiment, but words will not undo his death. I want justice, for him, for all the North, and for my sisters, who remain in Lannister hands. Renly nodded. We share a common foe. My plan is to move north along the King's Road, threatening King's Landing directly, while your men hold Tywin at Harrenhal or keep him off balance if he tries to come to the city's aid. With the Tyrell host and your own, we can outnumber any Lannister force. Should Tywin remain penned, we surround King's Landing from the landward side while my brother Loras and other admirals blockade the bay. The city will starve or yield. And what of Joffrey? Robb asked quietly. If he refuses to yield, if the city must be taken by force, how do we protect my sister? That is a challenge, Renly allowed. Your sister is a hostage. But if the city is under siege, we can arrange parley, offer terms for her safety in exchange for a swift surrender. The Lannisters hold the Red Keep, but if the Gold Cloaks turn on them or if the small folk riot against the Boy King, their position will crumble. Robb was silent a moment, picturing King's Landing in chaos. And what of you, Renly Baratheon? When the war is over, do you expect the North to bend the knee and rejoin the Seven Kingdoms as before? Renly's eyes flicked to Marjorie, who sat behind him with a calm, poised smile. I will not lie. The realm has long stood united, but we are in extraordinary times, and I can be flexible if it means securing a lasting peace. The Tyrells would prefer a stable alliance, a realm at harmony. If that means allowing the North greater autonomy, indeed even kingship, so be it, so long as we stand together in mutual defense. Let the East, West, and South see that our bond is unbreakable. He paused, then added lightly, and your father, I recall, was well liked by Robert Baratheon. As far as I'm concerned, the North has no better friend than the new King Renly. Catelyn, seated with the other advisors, considered Renly with a critical eye. These are grand words, your grace. Yet you would not be the first king to make grand promises, only to forget them when the throne is firmly beneath you. Renly gave a half-smile. True enough. Hence, we can seal our accord with oaths sworn before the gods, both old and new. My queen, Marjorie, can stand witness, as will the high lords of the Reach. If that is not enough, I propose a marriage link between our houses, if you desire. Perhaps if you have a brother or cousin of suitable age to wed a Tyrell or vice versa. We must weave our houses together if we are to share the realm in peace." Robb glanced at his mother, recalling her repeated warnings about becoming entangled in forced betrothals. But perhaps it would not come to that. "Let us first break the power of the Lannisters," Robb said. "Then we will speak of more permanent arrangements. For now, an alliance in war." They debated late into the night, hammering out a broad pact. The Baratheon-Tyrell alliance and the Kingdom of the North would coordinate military strategy against the Lannisters, each respecting the other's sovereignty. Once King's Landing was taken and Joffrey deposed, Renly would claim the Iron Throne, while the North's independence would be recognized in an official capacity. In exchange, Robb would assist Renly in quelling any Lannister remnants and would not march on the city alone to claim spoils. Both sides acknowledged that Sansa Stark's safety was paramount, and Renly pledged to do all he could to secure her release unharmed. It was a delicate balance, but on parchment at least it looked like unity. By dawn, the alliance was sealed with a ceremonial handshake and the blessings of a handful of present septons. Many northern lords remained anxious about trusting southern promises, but the lure of overwhelming force against the Lannisters was too strong. Preparations began immediately. The combined forces would mass near the Gold Road, moving east to isolate Harrenhal and cut the line of retreat to King's Landing. Scouts reported that Tywin remained in the fortress, likely ignorant of this new union. If they moved quickly, they might catch him wholly unprepared, or at least pin him in place while Renly advanced on the capital. So commenced a grand muster. The Tyrell bannermen, used to traveling with luxuries, took some time to gather their camp, load their wagons, and coordinate supply lines. Meanwhile, Robb's men were astonished by the number of horses the Reach Lords kept, and by the train of colorful knights and lords. There were near as many ladies and servants trailing behind, giving the Tyrell camp a festival-like air. For the hardened Northmen, it was a surreal contrast. But behind the pomp and color lay tens of thousands of swords and spears, a formidable war machine. Within a fortnight, the new allied host was on the march, banners of direwolf, rose, and stag floating side by side. Renly and Robb rode at the head with their retinues, displaying a show of unity for all to see. Marjorie Tyrell, escorted by a personal guard, rode in a carriage near the front, drawing cheers from small folk who glimpsed her beauty. Sometimes, curious throngs gathered along the roads, marveling at the spectacle of two kings traveling together. Whispers spread that the Lannisters' days were numbered, that the young wolf and the king in Highgarden would soon ring the city in steel. During the march, Robb seized any chance to speak privately with Renly about the potential risks. Tywin might attempt to break out from Harrenhal to protect the city, he said, studying a rough map. Or he might remain behind those walls, leaving Cersei and Joffrey to fend for themselves. Either way, we must remain flexible. Renly nodded. He's cunning, but we have the advantage of numbers now. If he marches out, you can fall upon his rear while I block him from the front. If he stays put, the capital is ours in all but name. What of Stannis? Have you had word? Renly's brow darkened. He refuses all parley. My last reports say he's amassed ships at Dragonstone and in the Narrow Sea, threatening the approach to the city's bay. If he strikes by sea while we come by land, the Lannisters may be forced to split their defenses. He paused, and a tension flickered in his voice. It might help us, but it also means my brother will want the throne for himself once the city falls. I must be prepared to face him if it comes to that. Robb studied Renly's face. We want no part in your quarrel with Stannis. Once the Lannisters are done, the North's war is ended. Our goal is simply to secure our independence. I understand, Renly said, forcing a smile, and I bear you no ill will. We each do what we must. As the allied host pressed on, the land showed more scars of warfare. They heard news of bandits and mercenaries terrorizing small folk, likely fragments of Lannister forces. Tyrell outriders and northern cavalry joined efforts to chase them down. The Great John returned one evening, a proud grin on his bearded face, announcing that he and some Reach Knights had slain a gang of brigands wearing half-torn lion surcoats. The cooperation fostered camaraderie between the typically aloof Northmen and the flowery knights of the south. One night, as the stars glittered overhead and the campfires cast dancing shadows, Robb found himself invited to dine in Renly's royal pavilion alongside Margaery, Ser Loras, and several highborn Tyrell ladies and lords. It was a formal affair, rich foods served on silver plates, minstrels playing soft tunes in the background. Robb had grown and used to such luxury. The simple bread and salt of the siege camp had become his norm, but he maintained his composure, mindful that appearances mattered here as much as on the battlefield. Margaery chatted with him politely, her large brown eyes warm and intelligent. "Your Grace, I've heard tales of how you outmaneuvered the Lannisters, capturing Ser Jaime and breaking the siege at Riverrun, and that you forced Walder Frey to yield his crossing with barely a drop of blood spilled. We in the Reach admire such skill." Robb inclined his head. "It was necessity. I had no time for Lord Frey's schemes." She smiled slightly. "And do you think the Freys remain loyal now? Or do they stir in your shadow, seeking a moment for betrayal?" A faint shadow crossed Robb's face. "Walder Frey is not easily trusted, but my uncle Brynden commands a strong garrison there. I doubt the old man can do much without alerting us." Renly, overhearing, chuckled. "I pity the realm that must treat with Walder Frey. A prickly old curmudgeon if ever I met one. But if he stays out of our hair, all the better." Ser Loras spoke up then, a faint trace of scorn coloring his words. "He will stay out of it if he knows what's good for him. This war is bigger than petty lords who pine for spoils." Before Robb could respond, a messenger arrived at the pavilion, breathless and dust-streaked. He bowed low. "Your Graces, word from the north, Harrenhal. Lord Bolton sends reports by Raven." At once, the music halted, and the gathered lords leaned in. Robb stood. "Speak," he commanded. The messenger swallowed. "Tywin Lannister remains within the fortress, but Ser Gregor Clegane has launched fresh raids on the surrounding lands, testing the siege lines. Lord Bolton repelled him. However, there is word that Tywin has sent riders south. Bolton's men intercepted some, but a few may have slipped past. Lord Bolton fears they carry pleas for aid from King's Landing, or from Lannister loyalists further west." Renly drummed his fingers on the table. "They will seek to muster more men, or perhaps call on the Westerlands to march east. Let them come. We'll face them in open battle." Robb's mind raced. "We cannot allow Tywin to gather more allies. The Westerlands have lords who might heed his call. We must move faster." Renly gave a decisive nod. "Agreed. We can be at the Gold Road in days, blocking any approach from the west. Then we turn east, drawing ever closer to King's Landing." So the next morning, the Allied host broke camp with renewed urgency. Gone were the more languid days of show and feasting. The Tyrell supply wagons still trundled behind, but the army's pace quickened, forging ahead on well-known roads. Scouts were dispatched in all directions to watch for Lannister riders. Every day, the forces of the two kings pressed nearer to the capital. They skirmished with minor groups of loyalist soldiers or local brigands. Small victories came easily. At night, the men told each other that a great reckoning was at hand. At length, they reached a key crossroads near the western hills that led either to the Gold Road or a more southerly route. There, they established a fortified position, hoping to intercept any Lannister reinforcements from Casterly Rock. Scouts soon brought word that a small host under Stafford Lannister, Tywin's cousin, was indeed approaching from the west. Barely 6,000 men, ill-prepared, perhaps hoping to slip north of the Allied host and reach Harrenhal. An opportunity to strike presented itself. Robb and Renly conferred. "If we cut them off, we deny Tywin any chance of reinforcement," Renly said, scanning a map. "They are outnumbered and unready. We can destroy them swiftly." "I'll lead the vanguard," Robb offered, though many of his men were weary from the march. "We've fought the Lannisters before. We know their tactics." Renly nodded. "Very well. Ser Loras and Ser Garland will support you. I will hold the main line in reserve to block any attempt at escape." This plan was put into action with astonishing speed. Within 2 days, scouts reported that Stafford Lannister's host was making camp near a shallow river crossing some miles west. The allied vanguard marched silently at dusk, concealing their numbers in the rolling hills, approaching under cover of darkness. Robb placed archers in strategic positions along ridges, while cavalry formed on the flanks. When dawn broke, the Lannisters found themselves practically encircled. Horns sounded the charge. What followed was a swift and brutal engagement. The Lannister troops, mostly levies and lesser knights, were taken by surprise and never fully formed a battle line. Robb's Northmen, hungry for a decisive fight, crashed into them with fierce discipline. Ser Garland Tyrell led a flanking charge, while Ser Loras spearheaded a wedge of knights through the Lannister center. The Grachan's bellowing war cries echoed as he hacked down foes in a swath. Grey Wind's presence alone terrified the enemy horses, and pockets of men threw down their arms in panic. Stafford Lannister tried to rally his men near a stand of trees, but an arrow found his throat before he could do much. His standard fell. By mid-morning, the Lannister host was routed, and the ground was strewn with their dead. Survivors were taken captive, stripped of weapons, and marched back to the allied camp in chains. Renly, arriving with the reserve, found the battlefield already won. He congratulated Robb on the swift victory, calling him the realm's most formidable young commander. Robb accepted the praise with quiet gravity, remembering that each victory brought him a step closer to the final confrontation but also cost men's lives. Now the path to King's Landing from the west stood open. No further Lannister reinforcements threatened from that direction. Tywin was pinned at Harrenhal, Stafford's force destroyed. Some men suggested pressing north to join Bolton and assault Harrenhal directly, but Renly was adamant that the capital was the true prize. If King's Landing fell, the Lannisters would be undone. Robb agreed for Sansa's sake. He could not waste more time, and so the allied host turned east, riding toward the Blackwater. Along the way, they encountered scattered refugees who spoke of turmoil in the city. Riots, rumors that Stannis' ships had been sighted in the bay. The city was bracing for siege. When at last the towers of King's Landing appeared on the horizon, their tops gilded by the setting sun, the assembled thousands of soldiers let out a collective roar. Tired, hungry, yet determined, they raised banners of rose, stag, and direwolf. The city sprawled across the hills, ringed by high walls that had repelled many an invader. The muddy waters of the Blackwater rush glimmered below. Faintly from afar, one could see the Red Keep perched on Aegon's high hill, the seat of Targaryen kings, Baratheon kings, and now the Lannister boy king. Renly commanded his outriders to scout the perimeter of the walls, looking for the best place to encamp. Reports soon arrived. The gold cloaks manned the battlements, and the city gates were shut tight. Cersei Lannister and her son, King Joffrey, had mustered what forces they could, but the mood within the city was said to be desperate, the small folk near to rioting over food shortages. The combined might of Renly and Robb would dwarf the defenders, but the city's walls and garrison were not to be dismissed lightly. A direct assault could be costly, and then there was Stannis, rumored to have a fleet just off the coast, waiting for the chance to strike. That evening, Renly and Robb stood on a slight rise overlooking the broad fields north of the Blackwater, a suitable spot for the main camp. Torches glimmered like a sea of fire behind them as tens of thousands pitched tents and dug fortifications. The wind carried the scents of mud and wood smoke. King's Landing rose in the distance, lights twinkling along the walls. Farther away, the black silhouette of the Red Keep loomed. A hush fell between them as they gazed upon the city. "It is different from a distance," Renly said softly, "than when you walk its streets. So many souls packed into that place, all living in fear of the next turn of fate. My brother Robert once ruled from that keep. Now a bastard tries to hold it. I have come to claim what should be mine." Robb stared at the city with quieter thoughts. "I have come for my sister," he said, "and for vengeance on the Lannisters. Once I have both, I am done with this place forever." Renly glanced at him. "A short while ago, I might have tried to dissuade you from leaving the Seven Kingdoms. But in these times, if we can bring about a stable peace, I will not stand in your way. Let the North be free if it must. Better that than endless war." Robb did not answer, only nodded. They stood side by side, two young kings on the verge of an unprecedented moment. Below, the city awaited, its people either ignorant of the doom that might befall them or resigned to it. Somewhere within those walls, Sansa Stark knelt in a tower, fearing for her life. Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne, a sword across his lap, or perhaps cowering behind his mother's wiles. The day of reckoning was at hand. That night, demands for surrender were carried to the city by heralds, who shouted from a distance that King Renly Baratheon and King Robb Stark commanded the gates to open, that the Lannisters must yield Jaime Lannister's captive father. Though Ned was dead, that memory weighed heavily, and set Sansa Stark free or face a joint siege. The only response was a volley of arrows from the walls. One herald died, pinned to the mud. Robb's men dragged him back, cursing the Lannisters for their cruelty. So the siege of King's Landing began in earnest, though it was not yet a complete encirclement. The allied host ringed the north and west of the city, establishing strong lines and watchtowers. The roads leading south were scouted, but rumor said Stannis had placed ships at the mouth of the Blackwater, blocking seaward escape. Inside the city, gold cloaks patrolled the walls, and the occasional catapult flung stones at the besiegers, to little effect. Civilians tried to flee, only to find the gates barred. Supplies were rumored to be low, which might bring a swift capitulation, unless Cersei found a way to bring in fresh grain or strike a last-minute deal. During those tense first days, Margaery Tyrell took steps to feed local refugees outside the gates, a gesture of goodwill that endeared her to the small folk who managed to slip out or were turned away from the city. Robb's men, for their part, tried to maintain discipline, but a siege camp was a breeding ground for trouble. The Great John roamed about, cracking the skulls of any soldier who tried to molest the locals. Catelyn Stark and other noble ladies tended to the wounded as best they could. Everyone wondered if it would come to a direct assault on the walls, or if the city would yield. Soon enough, a new twist arrived. Ravens from Harrenhal brought updates. Tywin Lannister had made no major move to break the siege there, though Gregor Clegane still led vicious but limited raids. Bolton had reinforced his lines, waiting, but Tywin's silence made Robb uneasy. The old lion was not one to lie down and die. Something was afoot, or so the young king suspected. Meanwhile, inside King's Landing, Joffrey grew more erratic. Stories drifted out that he had some of his own subjects executed as traitors, or had them whipped before the gates to show his power. The city's fear deepened. One crisp morning, an envoy under a white flag emerged from the gates, wearing the livery of the Kingsguard. Robb and Renly received them before the massed ranks of their armies. The man at the forefront was Ser Meryn Trant, clad in white cloak and battered plate. He read a proclamation in a shaking voice, that King Joffrey demanded the withdrawal of the rebel forces, that any attempt on the city would be repulsed with wildfire, and that Sansa Stark was unharmed for now but might suffer if the siege continued. A hush spread among the listening knights and soldiers. Then the Great John roared in fury, and only Renly's raised hand kept the men from slaying the envoy on the spot. Robb stepped forward, voice cold as ice. "Tell Joffrey that if my sister is harmed, we will slaughter every Lannister in this city. Our numbers are legion, and we stand with King Renly Baratheon. Your walls will not save you. If you want mercy, free Sansa Stark now and open your gates." Ser Meryn paled. "We have orders. Go!" Renly snapped. "Take these terms back to your so-called king." The envoy retreated, stumbling over themselves. A ripple of tension coursed through the allied lines. Renly turned to Robb, jaw tight. "They threaten wildfire. That's a dangerous weapon if used on the city walls or the river. We must be cautious." Robb nodded. "Aye, we both know King Aerys once stored caches of it. And with the pyromancers in Joffrey's service, it's a real threat." Still, the siege closed tighter. Towers of siege engines were built, catapults readied. The city stood on a knife's edge. Days stretched on, and starving peasants began to climb the walls at night, trying to escape. Some succeeded, only to bring horror stories of chaos within. The Gold Cloaks beating back crowds, food riots, roving gangs. Joffrey was rumored to be cowering in the Red Keep, appeased only by the cruelty of men like Ser Boros Blunt, who enforced his commands. Cersei orchestrated what meager defense she could, though the small council was in disarray. Finally, a small group of Gold Cloaks, perhaps a dozen, defected, slipping out one night with news. They claimed that Sansa Stark was indeed alive, kept within Maegor's holdfast. She was closely guarded. The Gold Cloaks also whispered that Cersei was considering a desperate plan, to ignite wildfire along the Blackwater if the siege turned hopeless. This revelation sent shockwaves through the allied camp. Renly, Margaery, and their top advisors held urgent councils. If wildfire was unleashed, thousands could die, friend and foe alike. Robb's mind reeled at the thought of Sansa trapped in that inferno. Time was running short. The city was close to breaking, but the Lannisters might choose a suicidal last stand. The question was how to save Sansa before such madness occurred. Ser Loras Tyrell suggested a covert infiltration. A small group of skilled knights or soldiers might slip in at night, using knowledge from the defectors and spirit Sansa out of the Red Keep. Risky, but if it worked, Joffrey would lose his last hostage. Renly was hesitant, but Robb seized on the idea. "I will lead them," Robb said at once, surprising the gathered lords. Catelyn, hearing of the plan, vehemently objected. "You are a king, Robb. You cannot risk yourself on such a venture. Let others do it." He shook his head. "She is my sister, and every day they hold her is an open wound. I'll not stand idle while she's in mortal danger." Renly also tried to dissuade him. "You are too valuable to the north. If we lose you, your entire realm. Then do not lose me," Robb interrupted, his voice set with finality. "I learned from my father T. Hat sometimes a lord must do his own work. I'll take a small band, no more than 10. We'll find a secret way in and out. The city is large, its walls manned, but there are tunnels, sally ports, hidden docks. The Gold Cloaks who defected might guide us." Thus the plan was set with a compromise. Ser Loras Tyrell and a handful of his most loyal knights would accompany Robb, as well as a few stalwarts from the north. They would attempt the infiltration in darkness, when the watch might be laxer, aiming to reach Maegor's holdfast through an old postern gate said to lead into the Red Keep's lower vaults. If discovered, they were to free Sansa or perish trying, then signal for extraction near the eastern walls, where a small Tyrell force would be waiting with boats to cross the Blackwater. It was a slim chance, but time for caution had run out. On the appointed night, the chosen group gathered near the water's edge, concealed by the tall reeds and the gloom of moonless sky. Clad in dark cloaks instead of shining armor, they carried weapons muffled to prevent clinking. Ser Loras wore a plainer breastplate, though his white cloak was folded and stashed in a satchel. Robb wore boiled leather, Winterfell's gray colors subdued in the night. The Gold Cloak defector who claimed knowledge of the hidden gate was a wiry, jittery man, but resolved to help for fear of what Joffrey might do to his family if the war continued. They pushed off in 2 rowboats, gliding across the black water with muffled oars. The city walls loomed ahead, faint lights glimmering from torches on the battlements. A hush of dread hung over the group. If they were spotted, archers could turn their boat to a pincushion in seconds. Yet luck was with them. The moon was hidden, and the watchers on the walls seemed more concerned with the main allied lines north of the city. Gently, they beached the boats on a narrow patch of muddy ground at the base of a crumbling quay. A broken section of the city's outer defenses had once served as a drainage culvert, now partially collapsed, rumored to connect to the Red Keep's labyrinth below. The defector led them into a low tunnel, nearly choking on the stench. Rats scurried at their feet. The tunnel curved upward, occasionally crossing rusted grates. After a few turns in total darkness, they emerged into a broader corridor of stone, lit faintly by a single torch in a sconce. The group paused to gather their bearings. Robb's heart pounded so loud he feared the Gold Cloaks above could hear it. Ser Loras's face was set in grim determination. Step by step, they crept deeper into the keep. Echoes of distant footsteps came and went. Once, they nearly stumbled into a pair of guards, but hid behind a row of wine barrels. The guards moved on, complaining about short rations. Further on, a small staircase led up. The defector insisted this was the route to Maegor's Holdfast, an internal fortress within the Red Keep. If Sansa was indeed there, they might find her in one of the upper towers. Every nerve screamed caution, but they had come too far to turn back. They ascended. The corridor above was lined with tall doors. Dim lanterns gave the group just enough light to see by. At a fork, they took the left passage. A hush enveloped them, broken only by the scuff of boots on stone. Robb prayed to the old gods that Sansa would be safe, that they would not fail her. At last, they neared a small door guarded by a single Lannister man-at-arms, half dozing on his feet. Ser Loras and one of Robb's men rushed him silently, daggers flashing. The guard let out a startled gasp but was silenced before he could shout. Blood pooled on the floor. Inside, the corridor led into a suite of rooms. At the far end, torchlight flickered. They crept forward, hearts pounding. The first door they opened revealed an empty bedchamber. The second was locked. A swift strike from a dagger loosened it. Inside was a small sitting room with tapestries of long-dead Targaryen kings. And there, near the window, they saw a slender figure in a plain gown, her auburn hair unbound. She turned with a gasp, eyes wide. "Sansa," Robb whispered, voice tight with relief and terror. She blinked in disbelief, tears brimming. "Robb? How?" He rushed forward, clasping her hands. Ser Loras guarded the door, checking the corridor. Another of Robb's men spread a cloak to wrap around her. She trembled violently, struggling to find words. "Robb, they said you wouldn't come. They said you couldn't," Joffrey said. She choked on sobs. "Oh gods, you're really here." He pulled her into a fierce embrace. "I'm here, Sansa. We have to go now." Quietly, she nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Arya. Have you seen Arya?" "No. We're still looking. Come." He took her hand. But before they could exit, footsteps rang in the corridor. A high, petulant voice pierced the silence. "What's going on in there? Open this door at once." Robb froze, blood turning to ice. It was Joffrey. Impossible luck. The Boy King must have come to torment Sansa personally. An instant later, the door slammed open, revealing Joffrey flanked by two Kingsguard knights in gleaming white, Ser Meryn Trant and Ser Boros Blunt. Joffrey's eyes went wide at the sight of intruders. "Traitors!" he shrieked. "Kill them all!" Chaos erupted. Ser Loras Tyrell sprang forward, sword already drawn, colliding with Ser Boros in a clang of steel. Ser Meryn lunged at Robb, who barely managed to shove Sansa aside and parry the blow. Joffrey stumbled back, squealing, "Guards! Guards!" Robb's men piled in from behind, outnumbering the Kingsguard. Steel flashed in the dim torchlight. Sansa pressed herself against the wall, trembling. Joffrey tried to flee, but one of the northern men seized him by the arm. He howled, thrashing, but could not break free. Ser Boros fell to Ser Loras's blade, blood streaming from a deep cut in his throat. Ser Meryn still fought desperately, cursing and swinging wildly. Robb feinted left, then hammered his blade into the Kingsguard's guard, knocking it wide. Another quick slash and Ser Meryn crumpled, his white cloak stained red on the floor. Only Joffrey remained, pinned by Robb's soldier. The Boy King's face contorted with fear and rage. "Unhand me!" he screeched, voice cracking. "Mother will, my grandfather, stop it. You can't do this." Robb raised his sword, panting. "Sansa, get behind me." She obeyed, tears sliding down her cheeks. Suddenly, Joffrey's eyes flicked to a dagger on the belt of the man restraining him. He jerked sideways, snatched the blade, and sank it into the soldier's thigh. The man roared, releasing him. Joffrey tried to bolt, but Robb moved like lightning, grabbing Joffrey by the hair and pressing the point of his sword to the boy's throat. Joffrey froze, whimpering. The corridor outside was filled with shouts now. Other guards had heard the noise. Time was short. Ser Loras slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. "We have to move." Robb felt Joffrey trembling under his grip. The desire to avenge his father, to avenge every cruelty inflicted on Sansa, surged like fire in his veins. He could end the boy right now, end the monster. Grey Wind wasn't here, but he could almost feel the wolf's snarl urging him on. Yet the memory of Ned's honor rose in him, the knowledge that Sansa was watching, that the boy was so young. He hesitated, sword trembling at Joffrey's pale throat. Sansa's voice, small and broken, whispered at his side. "He killed father. He tormented me." Joffrey spat. "I'm the king. You can't." He gasped as the blade pricked his skin. Robb's face was hard as steel. "If I kill him, we must fight our way out with the city on high alert. Sansa will never reach the boat." She stared at Joffrey's wretched, terrified face. Then she closed her eyes, tears slipping down. "Robb, do what you must." Robb exhaled a trembling breath. He slammed Joffrey to the floor, knocking the dagger from his grip. "I should kill you," he hissed, "but I won't risk my sister's escape. And perhaps it's a mercy to let your city see you fall from your throne." He turned to the soldier whose thigh had been stabbed. "Bind him, gag him." They trussed Joffrey like a hog, ignoring his muffled shrieks. Ser Loras stared in astonishment. "We're taking him with us? We'll trade him for our lives at the gate if need be," Robb said grimly. "Come on." The group dashed back down the stairs, hauling Sansa and the captive Joffrey. Guards pounded on the locked door behind them, shouting threats. Echoes of alarm bells rang out through the keep. Footsteps and torches approached from the far side. Twice, they had to fight their way past small groups of guards, but Ser Loras and the northern men fought with savage desperation, leaving bodies strewn behind. Finally, they reached the drainage tunnel, Joffrey grunting and thrashing as they dragged him. The gold-cloaked defector led them out into the night air. Bells tolled from the city's towers, torches flared along the walls. Shouts rose in the darkness, but the group scrambled into the waiting boats, pushing off into the black waters. Arrows hissed overhead, some striking the water with dull splashes. One boat took a hit near the prow. A soldier cried out, wounded. Robb cursed, paddling furiously. Sansa huddled low, clinging to the edge of the boat. Joffrey still lay bound, eyes wild with panic. Another volley came, but the darkness and the confusion spared them the worst. Within minutes, they reached the far bank, where Tyrell soldiers ushered them behind a wooden palisade. Cheers erupted as they recognized the king in the north returning alive, and with Sansa Stark rescued, plus a bound, gagged boy king in tow. In that frantic, surreal moment, Robb knelt beside Sansa, cradling her face. "You're safe now," he murmured. She sobbed into his shoulder, all the terror and pain flooding out at last. The onlookers parted, giving them space. Ser Loras and the others checked their wounded. Joffrey lay on the ground, bound like a prize hog. A wave of triumph coursed through Robb's men. The boy who had commanded Ned Stark's execution now lay helpless. By the time word reached Renly's pavilion, the entire camp was in an uproar. The formidable walls of King's Landing were still held by Lannister loyalists and the Gold Cloaks, but their so-called king was gone. Renly arrived in a hurry. "Seven save us, you did it!" he exclaimed, eyes darting from Sansa's tear-streaked face to Joffrey's bound form. "This changes everything." Robb tried to catch his breath, soaked in river water. His arms ached from rowing, fighting, carrying. "It does. They have no hostage for Sansa. Now we have the king they cling to. The city might capitulate, or Cersei might go mad." As if on cue, from the city walls came the roar of horns and the clang of alarm bells. Light flared in arcs along the ramparts, torches, catapults loaded with who knew what. A swirl of confusion as the allied camp realized the Lannisters had discovered Joffrey's abduction. Some spoke of a last-ditch assault. Others feared wildfire. Renly and Robb exchanged a look. They both knew the greatest danger was that Cersei might decide to burn the city rather than lose it. But for now, Sansa was safe, weeping in Robb's arms, and Joffrey Baratheon was a captive. The tides of war had shifted again, in a way no one could have predicted. The king in the north had come to King's Landing not as a conqueror with a great host at his back, but as a brother determined to save his sister. And in so doing, he had snatched the Lannisters' power from beneath their feet. The Red Keep might yet stand defiant, but without their boy king, and with Renly's and Robb's armies at the gates, how long could Cersei hold on? Night pressed close, filled with the clash of swords somewhere in the distance and the frantic calls of watchmen. But Robb could only think of Sansa's trembling hand in his, her tearful eyes bright with gratitude. He pulled her close, letting her sob against his chest, and in that moment victory tasted sweeter than all the feasts of the south. The war was not done. Tywin might still lurk at Harrenhal. Wildfire might yet ravage the city, and somewhere Arya remained missing. But for a heartbeat, beneath the stars and the swirl of torches, the king in the north allowed himself one measure of solace. He had saved his sister from the Lannisters' jaws. He had proven that, at least this once, love and courage could triumph over deceit. Come dawn, the war would rage on. Cersei would not yield quietly, and Stannis might arrive by sea at any moment. Yet no matter what storms lay ahead, Robb knew he would face them with renewed resolve, wolf and rose and stag standing together to topple the lion's den. And Walder Frey, simmering in forced submission at the twins, was but a distant shadow compared to the blaze of this final struggle. Let the old man scheme if he dared. The North had found its strength in unity, in honor, and in the stubborn hope that the realm might still be saved from the tyranny of those who would rule with cruelty and gold alone. When the first light of morning crept across the battlefield, the dark spires of the Red Keep stood out against a crimson sky. Robb Stark gripped his sword hilt, weary but resolute. The city might soon break, or it might erupt in flames. Either outcome would transform the future of Westeros. Regardless, the king in the north and his sister were together at last, and so began a new chapter in the war. A chapter forged not in betrayal at the twins, but in the unyielding choice to stand firm, to force submission where needed, and to risk everything for family and honor. No matter the final cost, the young wolf had changed the game, and the realm held its breath, waiting to see whether the flames of wildfire or the steel of united armies would determine the fate of the Iron Throne, and whether the North would truly stand free in the aftermath.